Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, and we are in Lycurgus. I don't know where in this paragraph we are, but they taught them also to speak with a natural and graceful raillery, and to comprehend much matter of thought in few words, for Lycurgus, who ordered, as we saw, that a great piece of money should be but of an inconsiderable value, on the contrary, would allow no discourse to be current, which did not contain in a few words a great deal of useful and curious sense. Children in Sparta, by a habit of long silence, came to give just and sententious answers, for indeed, as loose and incontinent livers are seldom fathers of many children, so loose and incontinent talkers seldom originate many sensible words. King Agus, when some Athenian laughed at their short swords, and said that the jugglers on the stage swallowed them with ease, answered him, "We find them long enough to reach our enemies with, and as their swords were short and sharp, so it seems to me were their sayings. They reach the point and arrest the attention of the hearers better than any. Lycurgus himself seems to have been short and sententious, if we may only trust the anecdotes of him, as appears by his answer to one who by all means would set up a democracy and Lacedaemon. 'Begin, friend,' said he, 'and set it up by your family. Set it up in your family.' Another asked him why he allowed of such mean and trivial sacrifices to the entities. He replied that we may always have something to offer them. Being asked what sort of martial exercises or combats he approved of, and answered, all sorts except that in which you stretch out your hands. Similar answers addressed to his countrymen by letter are ascribed to him as being consulted how they might best oppose an invasion of their enemies. He returned this answer: by continuing poor and not coveting each man to be greater than his fellow. Being consulted again whether it were requisite to enclose the city with a wall, he sent them a word: the city is well fortified, which hath a wall of men instead of brick. But whether these letters are counterfeit or not is not easy to determine. Of their dislike to talkativeness, the following apophthegms are evidence. King Leonidas said to one who held him in discourse upon some useful matter, but not in due time and place, much to the purpose, sir, elsewhere. King Charilaus, the nephew of Lycurgus, being asked why his uncle had made so few laws, answered, men of few words require but few laws. And honestly, too many laws, you end up everybody being a criminal, and that doesn't work either. When one named Hecataeus the sophist, because that, being invited to the public table, he had not spoken one word all supper time, Archidamidas answered in his vindication, he who knows how to speak knows also when. The sharp and yet not ungraceful retorts which I mentioned may be instanced as follows. Demaratus being asked in a troublesome manner by an importunate fellow, who was the best man in Lacedaemon, answered at last, he, sir, that is the least like you. Some company where Agus was much extolled the Athenians for their just and honorable management of the Olympic games. Indeed, said Agus, they are highly to be commended if they can do justice 1 day in 5 years. The Opompus answered, a stranger who talked much of his affection to the Lacedaemonians, and said that his countrymen called him Philolacan, a lover of Lacedaemonians, and that it had been more for his honor if they had called him Philopolitus, a lover of his own countrymen, and Pleistoanax, the son of Pausanias, when an orator of Athens said the Lacedaemonians had no learning, told him, "You say true, sir, we alone of all the Greeks have learned none of your bad qualities." One asked Archidamidas what number there might be of the Spartans. He answered, "Enough, sir, to keep out wicked men. We may see of their character, too, in their very jest, for they did not throw them out at random, but if the very wit of them was grounded upon something or other worth thinking about. For instance, one being asked to go hear a man who exactly counterfeited the voice of a nightingale, answered, "Sir, I have heard the nightingale itself." Another having read the following inscription upon a tomb, seeking to quench a cruel tyranny they at Selenius did in battle die, said it served them right, for instead of trying to quench the tyranny, they should have let it burn out. A lad being offered some gamecocks that would die upon the spot, said that he cared not for cocks that would die, but for such that would live and kill others. Another, seeing people easing themselves on seats, said, "God forbid I should sit where I could not get up to salute my elders." In short, their answers were so sensuous and pertinent that one said well, that intellectual, much more truly than athletic exercise, was the Spartan characteristic. Nor was their instruction in music and verse less carefully attended to than their habits of grace and good breeding in conversation, and their very songs had a life and spirit in them that inflamed and possessed men's minds with an enthusiasm and ardor for action. The style of them was plain without affectation, the subject always serious and moral. Most usually it was in praise of such men as had died in defense of their country, or in derision of those who had been cowards. The former they declared happy and glorified. The life of the latter they described as most miserable and abject. There were also vaunts of which they would do, and boasts of what they had done, varying with various ages, as for example, they had 3 choirs in their solemn festivals, the first of the old men, the second of the young men, and the last of the children. The old men began thus: "We once were young and brave and strong," the young man answered them singing, "and we're so now, come on and try." The children came last and said, "But we'll be strongest by and by." Okay, probably could have picked a better tone for that one, but indeed, if we take the pains to consider the compositions, some of which were still extant in our days, and the airs on the flute to which they marched on when going to battle, we shall find that Terpander and Pindar had reason to say the musing and valor were allied. The first says of Lacedaemon, "The spear and song in her do meet, and justice walks about her street." And Pindar, "Counsels of wise elders hear, and the young men's conquering spear, and dance and song and joy appear," both describing Spartans as no less musical than warlike. In the words of one of their own poets, "With iron stern and sharp comes the playing on the harp." And thus starts the rumor that gays are musical. I mean, I guess not any less than other people, right? For indeed before, because what we shared earlier, for indeed before they engaged in battle, the king first did sacrifice to the Muses, in all likelihood to put them in mind of the manner of their education, and of the judgment that would be passed upon their actions, and thereby to animate them to the performance of exploits that should deserve a record. At such times, too, the Lacedaemonians abated a little the severity of their manners, in favor of their young men, suffering them to curl and adorn their hair, and to have costly arms and fine clothes, and were well pleased to see them, like proud horses, neighing and pressing to the course. And therefore, as soon as they came to be well grown, they took a great deal of care of their hair, to have it parted and trimmed, especially against the day of battle, pursuant to a saying recorded of their lawgiver, that a large head of hair added beauty to a good face, and terror to the ugly one. When they were in the field, their exercises were generally more moderate, their fare not so hard, nor so strict a hand held over them by their officers, so that they were the only people in the world to whom war gave repose. When their army was drawn up in battle array, and the enemy near, the king sacrificed a goat. Goat's sort of a leader animal, so the leader sacrificing a goat. Commanded the soldiers to set their garlands upon their heads, and the pipers to play the tune of the hymn to Castor, and himself began the paean of advance. It was at once a magnificent and terrible sight to see them march on to the tune of their flutes, without any disorder in their ranks, any discomposure in their minds, or change in their countenances, calmly and cheerfully moving with the music, to the deadly fight. Men in this temper were not likely to be possessed with fear or any transport of fury, but with the deliberate valor of hope and assurance, as if some divinity were attending and conducting them. The king had always about his person someone who had been crowned in the Olympic games, and upon this account Lacedaemonian is said to have refused a considerable present which was offered him, upon condition that he would not come into the lists, and when he had, with much to do, thrown his antagonist, some of the spectators saying to him, "And now, Sir Lacedaemonian, what are you the better for your victory?" He answered, smiling, "I shall fight next the king." After they had routed an enemy, they pursued him till they were well assured of the victory, and then they sounded a retreat, thinking it base and unworthy of a Grecian people to cut men in pieces, who had given up and abandoned all resistance. This manner of dealing with their enemies did not only show magnanimity, but was politic too, for knowing that they killed only those who made resistance and gave quarter to the rest, men generally thought it their best way to consult their safety by flight. So, sometimes doing the right thing, you could say, has its motives, because why surrender if there's the rumor of being even worse mistreated? Hippias, the sophist, says that Lycurgus himself was a great soldier and an experienced commander. Philostephanus attributes to him the first division of the cavalry into troops of 50s in a square body, but Demetrius the Phalerian says quite the contrary, and that he made all his laws in a continued peace, and indeed the Olympic holy truce or cessation of arms that was procured by his means and management inclines me to think him a kind-natured man, and one that loved quietness and peace, notwithstanding all this. Hermippus tells us that he had no hand in the ordinance, that Iphitus made it, and Lycurgus came only as a spectator, and that by mere accident too, being there, he heard as it were a man's voice behind him, blaming and wondering at him that he did not encourage his countrymen to resort to the assembly, and turning about and seeing no man, concluded that it was a voice from heaven, and upon this immediately went to Iphitus, and assisted him in ordering the ceremonies of the feast, which by his means were better established and with more repute than before. To return to the Lacedaemonians, their discipline continued still after they were full-grown men. No one was allowed to live after his own fancy, but the city was a sort of camp, in which every man had a share of provisions and business set out, and looked upon himself not so much born to serve his own ends as the interest of his country. Therefore, if they were commanded nothing else, they went to see the boys perform their exercises, to teach them something useful, or to learn it themselves of those who knew better. And indeed, one of the greatest and highest blessings Lycurgus procured his people was the abundance of leisure which proceeded from his forbidding to them the exercise of any mean and mechanical trade, of the money-making that depends on troublesome going about, and seeing people and doing business. They had no need at all in a state where wealth obtained no honor or respect. The Helots tilled their ground for them, and paid them yearly in kind the appointed quantity, without any trouble of theirs. There's a Tad song, Helot, I don't remember the lyrics. So does it have to do with the workmen for the corporate overlords or something? I don't know. Or is it telling some version of a Greek myth, right? Because it kind of has a beat, you know, hitting the grind, you know. But to this purpose, there goes a story of a Lacedaemonian who, happening to be at Athens when the courts were sitting, was told of a citizen that had been fined for living an idle life, and was being escorted home in much distress of mind by his condoling friends. The Lacedaemonian was much surprised at it, and desired his friend to show him the man who was condemned for living like a freeman. So much beneath them did they esteem the frivolous devotion of time and attention to the mechanical arts and of money-making. It need not be said that upon the prohibition of gold and silver, all lawsuits immediately ceased, for there was now neither avarice nor poverty amongst them, but equality, where every one's wants were supplied, and independence, because those wants were so small. All their time, except when they were in the field, was taken up by the choral dances, and the festivals, in hunting, and in attendance on the exercise grounds, and the places of public conversation. Those who were under 30 years of age were not allowed to go into the marketplace, but had the necessaries of their family supplied for by the care of their relations and lovers. Nor was it for the credit of elderly men to be seen too often in the marketplace. It was esteemed more suitable for them to frequent the exercise grounds and places of conversation, where they spent their leisure rationally in conversation, not on money-making and market prices, but for the most part in passing judgment on some action worth considering, extolling the good and censuring those who were otherwise, and that in a light and sportive manner, conveying, without too much gravity, lessons of advice and improvement. Now, I think we all can learn from that. It's not, principles involved in the movement, and the action, not just the material wealth and whatnot included, right? But, light and sportive, it's not like there's, they're definitely, the entertainment and other goods that you have were definitely, part of the connection, right? nor was Lycurgus himself unduly austere. It was he who dedicated, says Sosibius, the little statue of laughter. Mirth, introduced seasonally at their suppers and places of common entertainment, was to serve as a sort of sweetmeat to accompany their strict and hard life. To conclude, he bred up his citizens in such a way that they neither would nor could live by themselves. They were to make themselves one with the public good, and clustering like bees all around their commander, be, by their zeal and public spirit, carried all but out of themselves and devoted wholly to their country. What their sentiments were will better appear by a few of their sayings. Padaretus, not being admitted into the list of the 300, returned home with a joyful face, well pleased to find that there were in Sparta 300 better men than himself, and Polycratidas, being sent with some others ambassador to the lieutenants of the king of Persia, being asked by them whether they came in a private or in a public character, answered, in a public, if we succeed; if not, in a private character. Argelianus, asking some who came from Amphipolis if her son Brasidas died, courageously, and, as became a Spartan, on their beginning to praise him to a high degree, and saying there was not such another left in Sparta, answered, do not say so. Brasidas was a good and brave man, but there are in Sparta many better than he. The Senate, as I said before, consisted of those who were Lycurgus's chief aiders and assistants in his plans. The vacancies he ordered to be supplied out of the best and most deserving men past 60 years old, and we need not wonder if there was much striving for it. For what more glorious competition could there be amongst men than one in which it was not contested who was swiftest among the swift, or strongest of the strong, but who of many wise and good, and was wisest and best and fittest to be entrusted forever after, as the reward of his merits, with the supreme authority of the commonwealth, and with power over the lives, franchises, and highest interests of all his countrymen. The manner of their election was as follows. The people being called together, some selected persons were locked up in a room near the place of election, so contrived that they could neither see nor be seen, but could only hear the noise of the assembly without, for they decided this, as most other affairs of moment, by the shouts of the people. This done, the competitors were not brought in and presented all together, but one after another by lot, and passed in order through the assembly without speaking a word. Those who were locked up had writing tables with them, in which they recorded and marked each shout by its loudness, without knowing in favor of which candidate each of them was made, but merely that they came first, second, third, and so forth. Now, kind of reminds you of modern politics, doesn't it? It's all about who's got, talking over people and yelling and making a big old noise. Media-wise, at least. He who was found to have the most and loudest acclamations was declared senator, duly elected. Upon this he had a garland set upon his head, and went in procession to all the temples to give thanks to what they considered to be their gods. A great number of young men followed him with applause, and women also singing verses in his honor, and extolling the virtue and happiness of his life. As he went round the city in this manner, each of his relations and friends set a table before him, saying, the city honors you with this banquet. But he, instead of accepting, passed round to the common table where he formerly used to eat, and was served as before, excepting that now he had a second allowance, which he took and put by the by the time supper was ended, the women who were of kin to him had come about the door, and he, beckoning to her whom he most esteemed, presented to her the portion he had saved, saying that it had been a mark of esteem to him, and was so now to her, upon which she was triumphantly waited upon home by the women. Touching burials, Lycurgus made very wise regulations, for, first of all, to cut off all superstition, he allowed them to bury their dead within the city, and even round about their temples, to the end that their youth might be accustomed to such spectacles, and not be afraid to see a dead body, or imagine that to touch a corpse, or to tread upon a grave, would defile a man. Well, perhaps some of that is a bit is an overstatement, because touching a corpse is definitely sometimes a greater risk than touching a live body, because the defense kind of goes away. So some diseases and stuff become a lot easier to catch with the dead body than the living person. In the next place, he commanded them to put nothing into the ground with them, except, if they pleased, a few olive leaves and the scarlet cloth that they were wrapped in. He would not suffer the names to be inscribed, except only of men who fell in the wars, or women who died in a sacred office. The time, too, appointed for mourning was very short, 11 days. On the 12th they were to do sacrifice to Charis, and leave it off, so that we may see that as he cut off all superfluity, so in things necessary there was nothing so small and trivial which did not express some homage of virtue or scorn of vice. He filled Lacedaemon all through with proofs and examples of good conduct, with the constant sight of which, from their youth up, the people would hardly fail to be gradually formed and advanced in virtue. And this was the reason why he forbade them to travel abroad, and to go about acquainting themselves with foreign rules of morality, the habits of ill-educated people, and different views of government. Withal he banished from Lacedaemon all strangers who would not give a very good reason for their coming thither, not because he was afraid lest they should inform themselves of and imitate his manner of government, as Thucydides says, or learn anything to their good, but rather lest they should introduce something contrary to good manners. With strange people, strange words must be omitted. These novelties produce novelties in thought, and on these follow views and feelings whose discordant character destroys the harmony of the state. Well, perhaps if they're being too fascist, the disharmony is there because people have different psychology and different material positions inherently. Doesn't mean they can't live on sort of the same principles, but he was as careful to save his city from the infection of foreign bad habits as men usually are to prevent the introduction of a pestilence. Hitherto I, for my part, see no sign of injustice or want of equity in the laws of Lycurgus, though some who admit them to be well contrived to make good soldiers pronounce them defective in points of justice. The Cryptia, perhaps, if it were one of Lycurgus's ordinances, as Aristotle says it was, gave both him and Plato to this opinion alike of the lawgiver and his government. By this ordinance the magistrates dispatch privately some of the ablest of the young men into the country, from time to time, armed only with their daggers, and taking a little necessary provision with them. In the daytime they hid themselves out of the way places, and there lay close, but in the night issued out into the highways and killed all the helots they could light upon. Sometimes they set upon them by day as they were at work in the fields, and murdered them, as also Thucydides, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, tells us that a good number of them, after being singled out for their bravery by the Spartans, garlanded as enfranchised persons, and led about to all the temples in token of their honors, shortly after disappeared all of a sudden, being about the number of 2,000, and no man, either then or since, could give an account how they came by their deaths. And Aristotle in particular adds that the Ephori, so soon as they were entered into their office, used to declare war against them, that they might be massacred, without a breach of religion. It is confessed on all hands that the Spartans dealt with them very hardly, for it was a common thing to force them to drink to excess, and to lead them in that condition into their public halls, that the children might see what a sight a drunken man is. They made them to dance low dances and sing ridiculous songs, forbidding them expressly to meddle with any of a better kind, and took a great number of the helots. They could by no means persuade them to sing the verses of Terpander, Alcman, or Spendon, for, said they, the masters do not like it, so that it was truly observed by one that in Sparta he who was free was most so, and he that was a slave there the greatest slave in the world. For my part, I am of opinion that these outrages and cruelties began to be exercised in Sparta at a later time, especially after the great earthquake, when the Helots made a general insurrection, and joining with the Messenians laid the country waste, and brought the greatest danger upon the city. For I cannot persuade myself to ascribe to Lycurgus so wicked and barbarous a course, judging of him from the gentleness